Blatnik Bridge reconstruction gets underway pretty soon, and with the project set to begin tonight, Northern News Now's Dave Anderson tells the story of the structure's namesake. This week's Holding On to History.
As a Minnesota state legislator, John Blatnik was exempt from military service during World War II, but that didn't stop him from volunteering for the OSS and dropping into the mountains of Yugoslavia. Minnesota State Senator John Blatnik was a Slovenian American from Chisholm. His knowledge of that language earned him an officer's commission in the Office of Strategic Services, which was the predecessor of the CIA. Captain Blatnik was tasked with working with the Yugoslav partisans fighting Hitler.
Going behind enemy lines and helping rescue downed Allied airmen.
It's been said that Blatnik rescued several dozen pilots and bomber crewmen while earning a Bronze Star for valor. The exact number isn't known.
A lot of his service was classified, so I think that's one of the reasons that he didn't really talk about it much after.
After the service, the former Chisholm school teacher became U.S. Congressman Blatnik and represented northern Minnesota for 28 years. He was in office when the High Bridge started construction in 1955 and when it was opened 6 years later. He was still in office when the span was renamed the Blatnik Bridge.
And in 1971, it was dedicated under Blatnik's name.
Brianna Fyant is the curator at the Richard Bong Veterans Heritage Center. The museum has created a touring display of Blatnik and his bridge, as well as Major Bong and his bridge. Museum staff hope the tour will last the entire 5 years it will take to replace the old Blatnik High Bridge.
Maybe even longer, knowing how construction goes. Hopefully it doesn't take more than 5 years, but it'll at least educate people.
Representative John Blatnik passed away in 1991. Holding on to history in Superior, Dave Anderson, Northern News Now.
Businesses interested in hosting the traveling history display of John Blatnik and Richard Bong are urged to call the Bong Heritage Center for details.